Hello, it's Adam from the Tudor Chest here. If you enjoy these podcasts, then perhaps you would consider becoming an official patron via my Patreon account or signing up to Apple Podcast subscriptions. I release an additional weekly subscriber-only episode via both my Patreon and Apple Podcasts, as well as bi-weekly Historian Unwrapped sessions exclusively to Patreon. From as little as £5 a month, you can access all content from the Tudor Chest. Just head to patreon.com/The Tudor Chest or search for the podcast in Apple Podcasts. Alex Walsh is the author behind the hit historical fiction series The Marquess House Saga. In Alex's books, she has built what I consider to be the historian's ultimate dream, with a compelling and fascinating story in which a pair of sisters find their lives entirely overturned and directly tied to significant periods of history. Consisting of dual timelines, Alex's series has reimagined the stories of some of history's most infamous women, telling alternative tales of the lives of Catherine Howard, Elizabeth I, Arbella Stuart and Jane Seymour, all of which, whilst fictitious, are plausible and so rich in detail that you can't help but think, I wish that this was all true. She joins me today for a fascinating discussion about her work, her inspiration, how she came up with the series, and much, much more. Welcome back to the Tudor Chest Podcast, episode 38, The Marquess House Saga with Alex Walsh. Welcome to the Tudor Chest Podcast, Alex Walsh. How are you?
I'm all right, thank you. Lovely sunny afternoon down here in Wales, so...
Lovely in London as well, finally. So we're here today. I'm really excited to have you come onto the podcast. We're here to talk about your amazing Marquess House book series. But before we get into that, just to get to know you a bit better, can you just give me a bit of an intro into your background, so where you grew up and what you do full time?
I grew up in West London, in Twickenham, and I went to school in the area as well. And then I was a journalist. I started work on a local paper when I was 19. And I've worked as a journalist pretty much ever since. I've worked in TV, newspaper, radios, every form, really. Just trying to think if I missed anything. But I did it, first of all, as a staff writer. So I began so many people do, just as a junior writer on the local paper. Then I got a job on a women's magazine, a national magazine, and I worked for IPC magazines as it was then, but it's no longer in existence, unfortunately, on and off for about 15 years, and then took a bit of a break and then came back again. And I've written probably for most newspapers, most magazines. I preferred being freelance because I prefer flexibility and I'm not very good at being employed. I find it a bit restricting. So that's what I did. But I always wanted to write fiction, and the journalism side was to I thought it would give me a good training ground, which it did, because I learned an awful lot about people, and especially working for women's magazines. Interviewed a huge number of women who'd been through difficult relationships and worked a lot with people like Women's Aid. And so it gave me a really good insight and into background about what real people felt and thought and wanted. And that's been an amazing way of learning how to write realistic characters. So the Catherine Howard conspiracy was the first book I had published, but it wasn't the first book I wrote. I'd written a couple of other manuscripts, but this was the first historical book, and I used to write it on my commute. I'd write longhand in notebooks for half of my journey, And then I'd put
Wow.
it away and properly get myself into a bad mood for the rest of the day for being at work, because that's what you do on your commute. And then
Yeah.
I'd type it up in my lunch hour if I had time. If not, I'd do it in the evenings when I got home. And that was how I got my first manuscript for the Catherine Howard conspiracy.
Wow.
And then I moved here to Pembrokeshire and started sending it out. I did have an agent, but she retired and found a new agent. And from there, the book got published. So that's very briefly my background. And I wrote films as well. Forgot
Wow.
that bit.
Done
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah. So I've always written. Everything I've always done has always been based around telling stories and writing stories in some form or other.
So, what sparked your passion for Tudor history? Was there, I mean, when you were a journalist, when you were thinking about writing, did you always
Mm.
have it in your mind that you would write something with history at its core?
Not immediately. I've always loved history. I've always found it fascinating. And I think the Tudors always drew me in because it was a period where a lot of women had power, which
Mm.
when I did my O level history, because I'm probably older than you think, O level history, we did the most boring possible version of the subject you could do. We learnt about coal mines and
Ugh.
oh God, canals and the Industrial Revolution, and it nearly put me off. And then
Yeah.
I kind of rediscovered my love of it again when I got into my early 20s by just reading biographies and things. And I'd always loved the Tudors, and I began to really be drawn to the female characters and the power that the women had. And I
Mm.
think that's what makes it a unique part of history. At one point, every single heir was female to the throne, and I don't think that's ever happened prior or since. So, it's
No.
and I think that was what drew me in, the fact that it was, the girls finally getting their say when I'd spent many years having to learn about all the men and their building projects, which were all quite dull.
Yeah. I totally agree with you though that it is. I find female characters from history far more interesting than the men.
Mm,
And when you look back as well, you realise just how prominent. I mean, even before the Tudors, the really it was a lot of women at the heart of the Wars of the Roses as well. There was so much.
mm.
There was a lot of female presence in that period of history. So, like you, I find those stories definitely more interesting, I think.
I suppose because they have to try harder to have their voices heard, even,
Mm,
especially then, they weren't traditional, they didn't traditionally get the power. So the fact that we still remember them and they're still there is is brilliant because they obviously had a huge impact.
couple of sort of just what ifs, really. So, if you could pick a single moment from history to go back and witness, you can jump in a time travel machine. What would it be?
Well, actually, I quite liked this question, and my immediate thought was there is one thing I've always wanted to know, and that is what happened to Boudica. So I'd go back to the Battle of Watling Street
Oh, wow.
in 61 CE, because that's a mystery that I don't think will ever be solved, and I don't like unsolved mysteries. So yeah, so if I could go anywhere, it would be so I could go back and see what happened to Boudica.
That's quite far back.
That's quite far back,
Yeah.
yeah, very far back. If you've got a time machine.
Quite niche. I had one of my guests on an earlier episode. He said that of all of the things, a bit like you, he was like, I just hate mysteries. And of
Hmm.
all of the things that he could say, he shocked me when he said, I'd love to go back. Well, not love. He said, I would go back and see what actually happened to Amy Robsart, the wife of Robert.
Oh yes, yeah, Robert Dudley's wife.
Yeah. And I was like, yes, but of all of
Mm,
the things, you choose that. But why not, I
yeah,
guess.
yeah, I suppose, yeah. And I mean, the other classic whodunit is The Prince is in the Tower, but I feel that's been very liberally covered. But I would just love to know what happened.
Yeah, I think on that note, I would love more than The Princes in the Tower. I would love to know because it would answer questions for me. So I've written a book about the rise and the fall of the Pole family, and it's coming out in the summer. And I would love to know.
I saw because I ordered it today on
Oh, well,
Amazon.
thank you so much.
All right.
But I would love to know what happened to what I refer to as the third Prince in the Tower, who was Henry Pole, Margaret Pole's grandson.
Yeah.
He vanished. He vanished inside the Tower of London, and I would love to know what happened to him.
Yeah, there's some really interesting stuff, or there was, because I used this as part of one of the conspiracy theories, just going slightly off tangent, about bodies buried in St George's Chapel in Windsor, and bodies that could be or couldn't be different members of the Plantagenets. And there, I'll find it and send it to you afterwards, so that we don't go too far away from what we're talking about. But there was some really interesting things about there were two different lots of children's bones that were found at the Tower of London. And then within the walls of St George's Chapel, another tomb was found, which also had the bones of two children, roughly sort of bone size, about possibly the right age. But at that point, Queen Elizabeth was still on the throne, Elizabeth II, and she refused any permission for DNA to see who these other two children, who nobody really knew who they were, but they were near Elizabeth Woodville's tomb. Nobody knew who they were. And when you check the website now, it's all gone. All that information has disappeared from the St George's Chapel website. So obviously I had to use that as part of the conspiracy theory. But it's really interesting to know, who were these children? Who were all these different children?
As I said, we're here today predominantly to talk about your wonderful book series, the Marquess House series. So for anyone who hasn't read them, and hopefully after listening to this, they will go and buy them in physical form or listen to them on Audible as I did, can you summarise the book series for us? What's it actually about?
The series is about secrets hidden within history. And these secrets they begin in the court of Henry VIII. But they have a knock-on effect into the present day. And the way that they can all be revealed is to reunite three pieces of jewellery, two ruby rings and a silver locket. And in the present day, the first ruby ring has just been found. So my wonderful heroine, Perdita, who really we both want to live her life.
Oh.
I know, it would be a dream.
Created the ultimate fantasy for a historian.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was doing on my commute every morning, creating what I would like to be living. Perdita and her twin sister Piper have an estranged grandmother, Mary Fitzroy, who is an historian. She dies, and even though they haven't spoken to her since they were 7 years old, she leaves them her entire estate, which is a huge manor house, Marquess House, down in Pembrokeshire. And when Perdita arrives, she begins to realise that the secret that's hidden in history is slightly more than just a secret. There are shadowy government departments. There are people being killed in order to keep the secret. And suddenly Perdita and Piper realise that they've solved the first part of it and they have the first piece of jewellery. And then suddenly they are in danger and they flee for their lives. And they now have to find the second ruby ring and reveal the secret that holds, and then the silver locket, and that will then give them the answers and hopefully keep them safe. And the secret takes us from Henry VIII through to Arbella Stuart, who and James I coming onto the throne. So it covers a massive section of history. But I loved it, and I, like you, I wrote it because I'd love that to happen.
Yeah, it's the dream. You inherit £300 million and a massive mansion with loads of Tudor stuff in it.
With a massive archive, your own library. It's just heaven, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a bit like getting the Harry Potter "you're going to Hogwarts" letter for a historian.
Yeah, it's exactly that. It's exactly that. And so to start with, it was a bit more modest. And then I thought, oh no, if I'm doing this, let's give them a massive manor and just huge amounts of money. And then they don't have to worry about anything, do they? They can just get on and pursue their quest.
As a historian, I'm always naturally wary of historical fiction. And I think that's a fairly common thing. But your books, you told these wonderful stories with, albeit fictionalized, but entirely plausible possibilities. So a sort of obvious question is, how did you come up with the idea for this? Because it's a big idea. There's so many aspects to it. So how did you come up with it?
I was demented by the end, trying to remember the things I'd changed. And that was why I had to have a break. If I can't write any more of these, I'm going to go insane. Well, I began, and I don't know if I'm hopping on to another question here, so I apologise if I do. The very kernel and beginning of the story actually became the story that became book two. And when I thought of this particular thing, and I sort of thought, that could work, but could it? I then had to sort of work backwards. And I suddenly realized that if I worked backwards and then I had to work forwards a bit as well before I got to the present day. And suddenly this whole story became enormous. I thought I knew quite a lot about Tudor history, but when I sat down to start writing it, I realized I absolutely didn't. And so I began, I probably could have done a PhD by the time I'd finished, especially with Catherine Howard, reading anything and everything I could find to see if I could make the theory fit. Because I thought there is no point me writing this if actually it's just nonsense. It's got to be plausible. Otherwise, you wouldn't have all the danger. You wouldn't have the threat. You wouldn't have a government department trying to keep this secret, trying to stop it becoming common knowledge. So it was a huge amount of research, and counting back from the first idea I had took me, I don't want to give away too much, so I'm not going to give the amount that I had to go to, but it took me back to Catherine Howard's execution. That was the date. And I thought, actually, that works. That could work. And then as I said, I started to research Catherine Howard in more depth. And when I discovered that her body has never been found, that was when I thought, I could probably make this work. Because the weird thing was, every plot twist I thought of, I could fit it in without too much wiggling of what was actually there. And when you're actually looking at the women as well, and especially, the character I loved the most in the first book was Catherine's half-sister, Lady Isabel Baynton, because she had been at court for years. She had been part of the court, and then suddenly her half-sister was queen, so she became incredibly important. But I thought, this woman has been there. And when you start looking at those people who are out of the spotlight, you find other bits of information, like her and her husband had actually been guardians for Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth. They're not particularly well known. So I kept looking for little things like that. And each time I needed something, I always call it a gift from history. It was like the right book turned up, or the right piece of information. And so slowly this story evolved. And I thought, I can make it work. If I hadn't been able to fit it in a plausible way and to actually make it appear real, I wouldn't have written it, because otherwise it would have just gone into the realms of fantasy, and that's not really my thing.
Although you have mermaids.
I do have mermaids. I do have a slight mermaid obsession. So, yeah. But that's more, the folklore side and things like that. So you've got to have a little bit of magic, haven't you?
Totally. So based on what my next question was going to be, you start with the Catherine Howard conspiracy, but based on what you've said then, that was not your original, and you weren't intending to start there, but that's what happened, essentially. That's
where it went to. Yeah, my original intending started point was where I began book two, the Elizabeth Tudor conspiracy, because it was the idea that formed that plot, which I think if I say Elizabeth Tudor and Mary Queen of Scots and their connection, it was that connection that made me think, that could work. And that, there's also the reason I thought this bit could work, because as I said with Catherine Howard, when I discovered her body had never been found, with the Elizabeth Tudor conspiracy, I found an amazing piece of information in the Antonia Fraser biography of Mary Queen of Scots, which may be true, maybe an interpretation, who knows, but it is actually published. So therefore you have to take it that this is to a certain extent verified. That when Mary Queen of Scots was born, the news came down to the English court that a child had been born. It was an ailing baby girl called Elizabeth. Her father, James the Fourth, wasn't it? Sorry, Mary Queen of Scots. Well, Mary Queen of Scots' father died, and she became queen when she was 8 days old. Yeah. And the next bulletin that came from the Scottish court to the English court was the child was hale and hearty and called Mary. And these are actual documents. And that was when I thought, so can they tell one baby from another?
Mm.
How do we know it's the same child? If
Yeah.
she was originally called Elizabeth and now she's called Mary. I know they were the two most popular names of the time, but
Yeah.
and these were actual court documents that are still in existence. So that was, again, that gave me that little, there are all sorts of strange little twists and facts if you actually look a little bit off the beaten track. So, yeah, so that was where the story began. An idea connecting Elizabeth Tudor and Mary, Queen of Scots. And from there, it all grew to be far bigger than I ever imagined it was going to be.
Did you always intend for there to be two storylines that would run alongside each other?
Not initially. Initially, I planned to keep it all contemporary. Because I thought, I suppose a bit Dan Brown-esque, keep it all and keep the thriller moving. But because of the changes in history, I had scenes where I had characters practically delivering history lectures, explaining what was right and what was wrong. And I thought, oh no, that's just too boring. It's too boring to write. It's going to be too boring to read. And that was when I thought, no, I'm going to have to split it and turn it into the dual timeline, because that's the only way to engage the reader and to get the historical story across. And then I can have my present day characters saying, oh yeah, but that's not what's in the history books. This is what really happens. But we've now discovered that this is what happened. So yeah, so it was the easiest way of telling the story.
So you've got in your modern setting, you've got the twin sisters Perdita and Piper. Perdita very much the central character, but then you've got the Mackenzie family. Was there any particular inspiration for these characters, or were they just total creations of your imagination?
Complete creations of my imagination. Alistair Mackenzie was always one of the first characters I thought of. I quite liked him in his slightly Dumbledore-esque mode of he knows everything. Because you've always got to have a character who has knowledge that you just afterwards think, how could he possibly have known that? But you need someone to deliver the information. But yeah, they were completely made up. It started off, actually, Perdita had a completely different name at the beginning, but it didn't work. In fact, the main characters in my very original draft were completely different. And I remember reading it and thinking, the thing that isn't working are my two main characters. And so awkward. I had to remove them. And I was like, oh no, if I just trashed the book. And then I came across the name Perdita, because Perdita means lost one. And I thought, well, that's quite good, because she is kind of a bit lost at the beginning. And it actually comes from first partly a Gilly Cooper book, who had a Perdita character, and also 101 Dalmatians, the original book. There were three parent Dalmatians, and one of them was called Perdita, who had been a lost dog. So I liked this name. And then one morning while I was doing my commute and writing, this question started going around my head, going, who's Piper? Who's Piper? And then I thought, oh, she's Perdita's twin sister. And slowly all these new characters began to fill in the gaps of the ones that I'd taken out, apart from Alistair, who has been there throughout. He's probably the longest standing character. So yeah, they're completely made up, completely from my imagination.
You paint Catherine Howard as a much more intelligent, level-headed character. She's at times naive due to her youth. You portray her at the age of 15, 16. Now, yes, your books are historical fiction. It's really refreshing, I think, to see Catherine not depicted as a strumpet, in the way that we so repeatedly see. Was this the conscious decision on your part to try and shift the way we think about Catherine?
It was actually to try and make her real, because I feel a lot of Henry's wives have become caricatures. And Catherine was a child, whichever way you look at it.
Yeah. She
was a child who was pushed into this very dangerous situation by an older relative. These days we call that child abuse. So, and as I said, when I was working as a journalist, I worked for a lot of women's magazines, and I interviewed a lot of people who'd been through a lot of very traumatic situations, and I wanted that side of it to come out, that real feeling of what a real woman or a real teenage girl would feel. And I have three nieces, and my eldest niece Daisy was the same age roughly as Catherine would have been when I was writing the books. And so I kept imagining her in the part, because I thought, yeah, she can come across with all the bravado and she thinks she knows everything because she's 15, nearly 16. You know everything when you're
Mm.
15, nearly 16, but then actually put you in a difficult situation with grown men, and suddenly that's a completely different situation. And this was what I wanted to get across, that actually Catherine had been a real person. She wasn't just a stereotype, she was the good time girl because she had the fling. She was a child. She didn't really know what she was
Mm.
doing. And she was suddenly given millions of
Yeah.
pounds and the king and all these things. Of course, she's going to behave strangely and she's going to have, it's going to be great fun for a while. But then the reality of what being married to the king must have hit home quite quickly. And that was what I wanted to get across. I wanted people to see her as a real person. So it was a very conscious decision to write her as I did.
Which is, and again, as I say, it's refreshing because I think it's one of the things that we invariably forget is that these people actually existed, and Catherine Howard was there was a woman called Catherine Howard who was briefly Queen of England, and I think we forget that. So it's refreshing when they aren't one note sort of caricatures. So that was really great to see. And in some respects, you another character who you paint slightly more favourably, I suppose, than we traditionally think, is her uncle, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk. Mm-hmm. Was it a deliberate choice, or do you think history has maybe been a bit unkind to him, or was it more of a kind of a straightforward plot point to get Catherine away safely?
It was a bit of all of those, actually, because, I mean, he undoubtedly was a very cruel, calculating and ambitious man. And you could see that by what he did to Anne and George Boleyn.
Yeah.
But this is several years on from there, and he's now lost a lot of people. And I don't think anybody could watch two family members be executed, especially young family members, and not be affected by it. And I think this was what I tried to do with the Duke of Norfolk. I mean, once again, he pushes Catherine forward and she's going to be queen. But I've wanted him to have that moment of the crisis of conscience, where he suddenly realizes exactly what he's done and he feels the loss and the pain. And that was why I had him at the end suddenly come good and he got her out. Because I thought, no, he's already sent one niece and nephew to the block. Could anybody truly, really do that without feeling something, some kind of contrition? So I wanted to give him a slightly better ending than possibly he deserved. But I come from a huge family, and I just think, God, imagine if these things had happened within my family and my cousins and my uncles and aunts. And I don't know, I think in the end, people do come good and blood does make a difference. So that was why I softened him up towards the end, and I made him actually save Catherine rather than send another one to the block. Yeah. But it was, he's an interesting character, I think. I think he was a very cruel man in reality, but I think everyone eventually softens somewhere. So
one of the things that I really enjoyed about your series is that you pepper it with little sort of historical Easter eggs, such as in particular surnames like Rivers and Woodville and stuff. And I could be wrong, but I seem to recall that you don't actually explain the relevance of these surnames in the story.
No, I just like them. I just throw them in.
So was it? It was a deliberate choice then to just history fans such as myself to go, oh, I see that surname. I know what you've done there.
It was exactly that. It was a little bit of amusement for myself while I was writing it. And also I like the name. I like the surname Rivers. I think it's and also often the way things look written down are quite good as well.
Yeah, the Fitzroy as well.
But yes, it was purely for my own amusement. It's like there are a couple of real people in there as well. So I've got a couple of cousins in there, and I've got a couple of friends whose names I've borrowed. And then once a few had seen them, then I had a few more people going, oh, put me in. So there are some real names in there as well. Kirsten Chaplin is a real person. And I did say, I said, do you mind if I make you a baddie? She went, oh, no, that'd be great fun. So it was more a bit of fun for me while I was writing it as well. But yeah, like you say, and for people to spot. So it was, there was no reason, just purely fun.
Book two, the Elizabeth Tudor conspiracy. I think of the series, it's probably the one that departs from history in the biggest way. So, how did you come up with this particular storyline? Because it is quite a convoluted storyline by the end of it, this one.
Oh, it is. And like I said, when I started doing these, I began making a timeline of Tudor history, so I could keep track of who was where at what time and what was happening historically and in other countries. And by the time I got to the second one, the timeline was growing, and then by the third one, my timeline now runs from 1432, I think, up to present day, and is nearly 700 pages long. I
Mm.
have to have it in sections and search it, and that was how the convoluted story of book two began. Because once you start pulling on the threads of history, and like you say, this one, I've added some characters who didn't really exist in order to tell the story. And once I'd started doing that, the plot got more and more and more complicated. I hadn't intended it to become quite as complicated as it did, but slowly it was almost like all these different historical figures just kept appearing and going, oh, put me in now, put me in. So yes, it is more complicated. It does move away. It wasn't intentional, and by the end, I was sort of losing track of who was who. I had big notes all over my desk going, right, this person does this does, because it's hard to hold it all. And when you're on like the third draft of it, you think, have I taken that out? Have I put it back in? Is it here? So, but um, yeah, so it grew and grew.
Yeah, because I suppose you make quite a habit in your series of also bringing women together who history tells us were enemies, and that you do that quite a
Mm,
lot. With the Elizabeth Tudor one, you've
yeah,
got Lettice Knowles and Elizabeth and Queen Elizabeth. You have Anne Boleyn and Jane Seymour, Anne Boleyn and Jane Boleyn. So I suppose as well that was I'm assuming quite a
yeah,
conscious decision as well to.
yeah. I mean, I look back on a lot of how we view Tudor history. A great deal of what we see is through the lens of the Victorian
Mm,
historians, most of whom were men, most of whom don't understand the dynamics of female friendship and assume that all women hate each other, which, in my experience, is not the
yeah.
case. I have many amazing friends, female friends. I have worked with some incredible women. And sometimes, even if you don't really like each other, you can still work together and get on in order to protect each other. And women are more likely to protect and stand up for each other than they are to turn against each other. And that was what I wanted to kind of get across in the books, that history is still very male dominated in the way that we look at history books and the way that it has been presented to
Mm,
us. And I wanted to change that because I think women see it very differently.
yeah.
And so that was why I deliberately put people together who we're always told were enemies. Because I think, really, were there that many women all screaming and shouting? It's like Elizabeth with the Elizabeth the First. There is the constant, she hated everybody. If she really hated everyone, why did she have so many women around her? And why did she pay for so many of the
Mm,
funerals? And why did she look out for them? And why did she care about them? What she hated was being lied to when one of them got married without telling her, because it caused political
mm,
issues. Suddenly, they were no longer just directly answerable to her, they were answerable to her husband. So it's, I don't know, I think the female way of looking at it is quite different to the way that we've been taught it over the years. And that's what I wanted to make people think about.
yeah.
I mean, I might be wrong. They may have all absolutely loathed each other, but, I like to think that basing it on women I've known and women I've worked with, that actually there is a certain amount of sisterhood going on as
Mm.
well. And you are looking out for each
Yeah,
other.
I've never ever understood the theory about Anne Boleyn and her sister-in-law Jane hating each other. I just
Mm,
don't. There's no record of it. There's no record that it was Jane Boleyn who provided evidence. All the evidence is quite
mm,
contrary to that, and I don't. I've always thought when you take a step back, it also doesn't actually make sense. I mean, this was a woman who,
exactly.
by virtue of whether we like it or not, it was a very patriarchal society, and Jane Boleyn's position was via her marriage. She was a Boleyn. I don't.
Yeah,
She wouldn't have rallied against it, you know. And I've never
definitely not.
understood that argument that she was this sort of evil shrew that brought her husband
Mm.
and sister-in-law down. There's just not the evidence for it, in my opinion.
No, I completely agree. I think she's one of the really maligned figures
Mm,
in Tudor history. But again, that's a very classic Victorian trope, isn't it? When you look at a
yeah.
lot of their novels and the Gothic novels of the period, you know, the embittered wife.
Mm,
And yet really it doesn't fit. Like you say, there's no evidence to fit.
yeah,
And
precisely.
briefly going back to Catherine Howard, with her affairs and all the things she's supposed to have done, there's also not a great deal of evidence to make any of that fit. It's all very convenient that the bits of information that have been left behind absolutely are the bits that condemn her. There's
Yeah.
nothing to save her. So again, I think there's a great deal that's been taken for granted and then spun into a story which has then been taken as fact. So it's hard to know.
You have two Elizabeth Tudors in your second book,
I do.
one being Elizabeth the First, and the other your fictionalized daughter of Catherine Howard.
Yeah.
You mention at the end of the book that the reader could take either of these Elizabeths as the book's subject matter. Really
Mm.
clever idea, but should we assume that actually what you're alluding to is that you mean your fictionalized Elizabeth was the one that we should be?
Yeah, that is the one that you should, but not everybody, I think, has really noticed that. It's funny how so many people haven't. And when, like I said, me and my publisher and my agent, we spent a great deal of time deciding on the title for that book because it had several others,
Mm,
and some gave away too much information, some the characters weren't well known enough. And in the end, we settled on that and we went, yeah, that works because that's really quite clever the way we've got the two. Originally, it was called The Two Elizabeths,
right.
but then the conspiracy brand was sort of created by the publisher. And so we had to stick with that. So, yeah, that had been my original title for it. So, yes, that was my little. I got my two Elizabeths both on the cover again. But yeah, you're completely right. That was the one that you were supposed to be thinking of,
Mm.
but you don't necessarily realize that at first.
Your third book deals with one of the most fascinating but very overlooked figures from
Oh, Arbella.
the early Stuart era, Arbella Stuart, at what
Mm,
end of the Tudor period and start of the Stuart period. And I was
yeah,
so thrilled that you chose her as a character because I think, I mean, I've read Sarah Griswood's book. She actually was on my podcast. Fascinating
yeah.
character, very, very overlooked. What was your decision behind that? Was it because she is so overlooked?
Yes, because she's so overlooked, and also because she had a really strong claim to the throne. And
Mm,
I think that, you could have argued that she had a slightly stronger claim having been born in the country, because that was one of the Henry VIII's laws. If someone,
yeah, well, that's what made the Grey
yeah,
sisters bumped ahead of Scotland because
exactly.
they were born in
Yeah,
England.
because they
Yeah.
were born in England, and James had never been to England. And yes, he was descended from the elder son, but he didn't fulfill the criteria. I think the nobles, the male nobles at the time, had just had enough of there being women on the throne, and they decided that James was the next best bet rather than another untried woman. But I really think she should have been queen. And when I discovered her years ago, and I discovered her through the Sarah Griswood book as well, I just thought, oh
Mm,
no, there's a story here because she has basically been robbed. And how different might the country have been if her or the Grey sisters had actually been given their due inheritance after
mm.
Elizabeth died? So yeah, it's very interesting. And have you read hang on, let me get the book 1 second. Um Elizabeth, The Forgotten Years, John Guy.
No, I
Oh
haven't.
my God, read that. You will absolutely love it because quite a lot of the information that I found that helped me to spin the conspiracy theory for the second book, I found in there. And some of the stuff he's uncovered is just phenomenal. So I would completely recommend that. But yes, that was why I wanted to bring Arbella in because I felt she had very much been robbed of her right to be on the throne. And the more you investigate Arbella, the more interesting she becomes as well.
Yeah, she was a fascinating character, and yeah, she's just
Mhm.
yeah, just missing from history in many
Yeah.
respects.
What I found really interesting about her was that the sort of the perceived view was very much, she was mad, she wasn't listened to by the powers that be. But when you actually go into it, she had so many people who were loyal to her and so many friends. And I found a whole sort of raft of people who had all been staunchly supporting her all the way through, that I thought, when you actually look at the evidence, that again, like we were saying, the evidence doesn't follow what we're being told, because she obviously was a very caring person, because she had so many people who were willing to take so many risks for her. And you don't do that for someone you don't like. So that was the other thing I wanted to get across with Arbella, that she was not this completely crazy person who everybody just wanted to keep shut away. She was actually a very intelligent, politically savvy and caring woman who was robbed, I think.
In your book, you paint James I as a real religious zealot. He's obsessed with witchcraft, and now we know that James I was actually quite obsessed with witchcraft. But you make the very bold move to actually have Arbella burned at the stake.
Yeah.
And I mean, I was shocked when I was listening to it. I was like, no, she's not gone there. But you go there.
No, she's not going to.
What made you decide to go down that route? Because we know that's not, thankfully, we know that's how Arbella didn't die, but it was quite a move,
no, she didn't.
I suppose.
It was because of the Lennox jewel. I think it belonged to Margaret Douglas. It's a while since I wrote this, so I apologise if I get this wrong. But again, there is a brilliant description of it in where is it? The Tudor Princess by Alison Weir. And there is an amazing description of this Lennox jewel, which is incredibly detailed and has got all sorts of quite strange symbolism in it. And when I read this, and I read that years ago, and it stayed with me because it was so unusual. And there are a couple of bits in it that relate to fire.
Right.
And to devils and things like that. And I thought, that could be interesting, because she was the Countess of Lennox, I think, at one point, Arbella. And so the fact it was the Lennox jewel, the fact it came down through her grandmother, I just thought perhaps the Lennox jewel was about somebody else. Perhaps this is the end of the story. And it was that inspired me to give her the end that I gave her, because then Perdita and Piper and Kit and Callum all sit and discuss it and go through the symbolism and go, well, that's obviously what it must mean. And so, yeah, it was that really pushed me to sadly give her the end that I did. So sorry, Arbella.
Well, the main thing is it's not how she did die, thankfully. So that's a good thing. We learn at the end of the book that Perdita and Piper are the direct descendants of Catherine Howard. Now, I was fairly convinced from the outset that that's the way it was going to go, particularly when you started adding in little clues like when they're referred to as by the Majesty title, I seem to recall. Was that, again, was that always kind of planned, or was that something that developed over time?
Yeah. No, that was always planned. It was just working out how to get there was the hard bit. But yeah, no, that was always the plan, that they were actually the direct descendants. And that was why they'd always been watched, but that was why they'd always been kind of not allowed to know and kept secret, because it could have been too controversial, because it's possible
they were a second royal family, essentially.
Yeah, they were a second royal family, and they had a stronger claim than the current royal family. So they had to be kept there just in case, because you never know when you might need a spare royal family. But they couldn't really be allowed, and that was why for so many years Mary stepped back from them so that they wouldn't be hurt and they wouldn't be chased by MI1. So yeah, no, that was always the plan. Because wouldn't that be fun? If you discovered not only have you got your manor house and all your money and you can sit and read Tudor documents all day, but actually you've got a claim to the throne too.
Yeah, that would be pretty exciting. I think it would just be too much to process. But yes, I mean, that would just be the biggest thrill,
really
wouldn't
it?
It? The original plan was a trilogy, but you came back with a fourth book, the Jane Seymour conspiracy. So
I did.
What made you come back, and sort of what was the decision behind making it Jane Seymour centric?
Mainly because I started to research what I thought was going to be another series. And the research I began doing was actually for Anne Boleyn's mother, because I thought she's never really been written about. But the more
hidden.
Yeah, so hidden. And I really do want to write about her. I want to do all of Henry VIII's mothers-in-law, because I think that would be a really fascinating book. Yeah, because that's never been done anywhere as a a whole compilation. So began researching her, and then obviously Anne becomes a huge part of the story. And then Jane Seymour started cropping up because they are all connected and they're second cousins and they're related. And the story that I started to try and write didn't work. And no matter how I tried to fit it and how I tried to do it, it just didn't work. And so one day I thought, I think I've written a Marquess House story. And so I thought, all right, let's do a little writing exercise here of my own. And what if I were to make this a Marquess House story? And what if I were to put Perdita and Piper in, and Kit and Callum and Alistair? And suddenly the whole story just emerged. And I thought, that's why. Clearly there was another one at the back of my brain that wanted to come out. So I spoke to my agent and said, I know it's a trilogy, but how do you think they'd feel if I wrote another one? And gave her the synopsis that I'd written. And she rang me back about half an hour later and said, yeah, they're happy to do it. In fact, they're going to send the contract over this afternoon. I was like, oh, okay.
Shit. Let's do it then.
Yeah. Okay. I'll be doing that one now. Yeah. And so it sort of, it wasn't one I'd planned to write. But it just came, and with it, more of the story came, and I realized there was still more of the story to tell. So, so it ended up being a saga instead of a trilogy. I mean, obviously it differs because it doesn't have the chase for the jewellery. And that was why I'd originally done the trilogy, because it was the 3 pieces of jewellery that revealed the secret. But there was still stuff to say and still stories to tell. So, that's how we ended up with the 4th one, by mistake almost.
And it was going to originally be focused on Anne Boleyn, is that correct?
It was, yeah. But unfortunately, she died too early in proceedings for the book to be able to do what the book needed to do. I needed to take it up to the Pilgrimage of Grace and then beyond. And unfortunately, Anne didn't survive that long. So I had to sort of swivel it round. And that was when I decided to start looking at Jane Seymour. And the research for her turned out to be, well, extremely interesting, because there are so many gaps, because obviously people were only really interested in her once she became queen. And so before that there aren't many records of her. So we've got some that when I was laying out my timeline completely contradicted each other from several different historians. No one could really decide where Jane was, what she was doing. There's no record of any suitors for Jane except one, which was sort of knocked on the head quite quickly. And the more I found, the more I thought, there's a story here waiting to be told, because there's so many gaps. Because where was this woman? You know, she can't just disappear off the records for 4 years. You know, she must have been somewhere, but there's no record of her at Wolf Hall. There's no record of her at court. There's no record of her with Catherine of Aragon. And so you think, so where the hell was she? And that gave me plenty of space to fill in. So
yes,
yeah,
because your Jane Seymour is very different to the one that we traditionally see. You paint her as quite a racy, flirtatious woman, quite a force of nature. I imagine there was quite a delight, I suppose, in effectively entirely rewriting the story of a woman who we're sort of repeatedly told was the human form of beige. You know.
Yeah. Well, that's what I thought. I thought nobody who could survive the Tudor court and who was brought up in and around the Tudor court could be that innocent that long. It doesn't follow. It really doesn't. And so I just thought, no, I feel as though Jane was reinvented once Henry saw her, and she had to be everything that Anne Boleyn wasn't. She had to be quiet. She had to be demure. She had to be the perfect Tudor woman, because Anne had been this feisty wildcat. So I kind of felt that her family said to her, right, this is what you have to do. We're going to reinvent you and present you as this perfect Tudor woman in order to grab the king, because, you know, we want you to be queen. We want our family on the throne.
Yeah.
And so I just thought, well, she probably didn't have much choice in the matter, because women didn't back then. But I loved the idea of her actually having had quite a racy time up until then. And and just being a fairly normal person, anyone who's pushed around or told to do this or not do that, sooner or later you're going to go, "Eh, I'm going to do my own thing." Like when I have her poking her tongue out at Catherine of Aragon and things like that. Catherine of Aragon slams the door and Jane pulls her face and pokes her tongue out at the shut door. I thought you would, wouldn't you? No matter who you
Yeah.
are, you'll kick back a bit. And I don't know, I wanted to make Jane again, like with Catherine Howard, I wanted to take away the stereotype and make her feel like a real person.
And I like that you marry her secret husband in it is Francis Bryan, who I don't know about. I've always had
Yeah.
this theory that he probably was a real hunk. I don't know why, but I've
Yeah.
just got this. Maybe it's because I'm being influenced by the Tudors, which I actually thought was drivel. I didn't really like the Tudors very much.
It was mad. It was quite bonkers, that, wasn't it? It really was.
Yeah, Francis Bryan does. He comes across as a real sort of hunk. I think it's even part of just having the eye patch just adds a little. There's a bit of danger with Francis Bryan. So I was quite happy that you brought him in as her husband in secret.
Yeah. Well, apparently he did look out for the Seymour youngsters. He was the one who got them
Mm,
into court. So because he was a distant cousin. And so a bit like you, I rather like that because I think he had that twinkle in his eye, didn't he?
yeah, only in the one.
Yeah, just in the one. So yes, I quite liked him. And the one I've nearly finished, I've got Charles Brandon in because again, probably influenced a bit by the Tudors. I always thought he was probably quite dashing too.
Yeah, you're imagining Henry Cavill.
Of course I am, yes. Why wouldn't I?
So my final question then is what are you working on next? Is there going to be a fifth book, or as part of the Marquess House series, or
Yeah.
are you going into something completely different?
Well, earlier this year, I had The Secrets of Cresswell Hall come out, which was a gunpowder plot revisiting because it was told through the eyes of the wives. It was a dual timeline. So I've been working on that. And since then, I've been writing one that, again, dual timeline, that is based on Anne Brandon, the daughter of Charles Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk. I've nearly finished that. That will be delivered next week. So that will be out later this year. It doesn't have a title yet, though, so I can't do any big reveals, unfortunately. I mean, it has a working title, but I don't think that will be the final title. Um, Marquis House books, I feel there could
Right.
possibly be a fifth one because there is still a baddie out there who has not been accounted for,
As in a modern day baddie.
a modern day
Right,
baddie.
okay.
Yeah, who could come after Perdita and Piper again. And obviously, at the end of Jane Seymour, they were bequeathed or sort of were given another huge number of archives that had belonged to Randolph and
Mm,
Xavier.
yeah, the
So
Connors.
there is potential for more information to be discovered. Um, but at the moment, my books are with two different publishers. So Marquis House is with the old publisher, and I'm now writing for somebody different. So that is what might make it more tricky. But there is potential for a fifth. And then I think that would be the final Marquis
Mm.
House.
But and do you have a figure from the past that you would focus it around yet?
Possibly, but it's very sketchy at the moment. So, but it's mainly
Okay.
because I haven't allowed my brain to go there. Because if I do, then I could very easily get lost back in the world of Marquis House, and I have to keep them quite firmly at the back of my mind because I do love hanging out there. So,
Yeah, it must be, I suppose, and it's actually very in a very similar way. I remember watching an interview, sorry, with J.K. Rowling, where she said, when she came to the end of writing the Harry Potter books, it was a bereavement because
mm,
for her it was escaping into this other world, and I suppose for you, it's a very similar thing. You've created this, as we've said, historian's dream scenario. So to sort of fall into that world and just, imagine would be really comforting and a thrilling place to exist.
oh, I love it. I love being back at Marquis House. I really do.
Yeah.
And I can see them all so clearly, and I can see the house so clearly. So, yeah,
We need a TV series. That's what needs to happen.
I'm trying. I'm trying.
Are you?
I'm trying my hardest. Yeah. So I mean that would be fantastic because I think they translate quite well because you've got
Oh, I
the
agree.
present day mystery. to push it, and then you can cut away to different things. And especially with
Yeah, no, I think it would be an amazing series.
oh well, we'll keep pushing for it because I think it could be quite fun. I've already cast it in my head, so you know.
I'll have you. Who's playing Perdita?
Well, Perdita, I have to say, she's the one I'm still struggling on because she changes with different people. Um, but Kit, I would like to be Kit Harrington because that was who I was imagining while I was writing it.
Quite short though.
That's the only trouble because Kit in this is like 6'4". So
Yeah, Kit Harrington's a little wee fella. I think he's
yeah,
like 5'7".
I know. So, but I suppose if we got a short Perdita and it could work. But
Yeah.
and Alistair, I'd quite like Robert Glenster to be
Okay.
Alistair. He would be quite interesting.
Yeah.
Um, Henry, I'm not sure because Henry is just by that time he's quite old and evil and mean, isn't he? Henry VIII by then. But yeah, it's one of my games I play. I have a little list of who would play who.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for coming on and for discussing your world of the Marquess House series. It's been a really interesting conversation. And as I said, I was so pleased to talk to you because I adore your books. I just think they're so
Oh, thank you.
fun and fascinating, and so they're perfect sort of escapism, I think.
That's what I wanted. I love a book that makes me think and makes me guess till the end. And that's what I tried to do with this, to keep the plot coming, but to keep twisting you in different directions so that by the time you got to the end, you really were beginning to question history and go, well, maybe
Mm,
this did happen. I had a few
yeah.
people when it first came out, a couple of historians commented on Twitter and went, I know this didn't happen, but dot, dot, dot. It was like,
Kind of wish it did.
it would be great, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, you're very welcome. So, where can people find you?
I am, all the Marquess House books are on Amazon and they are available as ebooks, as paperbacks, and audiobooks. So they are through Audible as well. The audiobooks are also on Apple Books and they are in lots of libraries too. So you can always request them at your local library. And I think they can be ordered through Waterstones as well.
And you're on Twitter as well, X as we now call it.
I'm on Twitter as Purple Mermaid 25 and Instagram the same.
All right. Well, thank you again, Alex, for coming on. It's been a really interesting conversation, and hopefully we'll see your creation on TV at some point.
Let's hope so. And thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it.
And so that brings me to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chess Podcast. My thanks again to Alex Walsh for coming onto the show and sharing her story with us. Next week, I am back to full programming following the bank holiday with a subscriber-only podcast focusing on the arrest of Anne Boleyn, and in the main episode, I will follow on directly to explore Anne Boleyn's trial. Please reach out with any podcast suggestions. I would love to hear from you. Thank you again for listening, and speak soon.